Saturday, October 29th, 2016, Monaco 64, home of alternative economics and contrarian views. So I want to talk about the U.S. national debt today. There's a lot of misconception about it, and I think there's a lot of blame being thrown at the wrong people. I actually don't think presidents are to blame for the national debt. I think, presidents are just figureheads. They're like CEOs chosen by the shareholders of a big corporation. And in my opinion, the people who run the central banks, the people who created the Federal Reserve back in 1913, they are the powers behind this machine of debt. Even though we didn't have complete fiat money until 1971, the Federal Reserve was created in 1913 and it came into existence in 1914. And I think, by coming out and having a go at President Obama about the debt, partly true, it has gone up quite a bit since he's been president. It's actually gone up by 7.9 trillion according to thebalance.com. It's U.S. debt by president by dollar and percent. So he inherited 11.6 trillion from George W. Bush. And so it's an increase of 68%. So he hasn't doubled the national debt. But we actually need to go back to 1914. And that's an interesting year because it was the year the Federal Reserve came into operation. Woodrow Wilson was president. He signed the Federal Reserve Act into law. And at the time, he inherited 2.9 billion of debt, 2.9 billion, not trillion, from the previous president, President Taft. And by the time he left office, the U.S. had 24 billion in debt because of World War I. So we wouldn't have had that debt if it wasn't for World War I. The national debt in the U.S. would probably still be 2.9 billion, because in the first 3 financial years of the Wilson administration, there was almost no increase in the debt, very little increase. So, yeah, the main culprit for that increase was the war. So there was a 727% increase in the national debt because of World War I. And Barack Obama, under President Obama, the national debt has gone up 68%. So percentage-wise is a lot less. So then we need to go, we go forward a little bit. Between the wars, we had 3 presidents, Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover. And Harding and Coolidge, actually, they paid down $7 billion of the national debt. Hoover added $6 billion. So by the time FDR became president, the U.S. actually had $23 billion. So the national debt had gone down by $1 billion since President Wilson. But when he left office, President Roosevelt, and what did we have under President Roosevelt? We had World War II, and when he left office, he left, let's have a look here, he left $259 billion of national debt to President Truman. So he came in, there was $23 billion. He left, there was $259 billion. That would never have happened if it wasn't for World War II. So that was an increase of 1,048%, the debt increase under President Franklin Roosevelt. So a bit more than President Wilson, who had a 727% increase. But, Barack Obama, President Obama, 68%. That's not good, but it's compared to those 2 presidents, it's peanuts. I would dare to add. And then, I've had a look as well, trying to compare what would have happened if we hadn't had the wars. And I had a look at some numbers here. Let's say under President Wilson, if the U.S. hadn't gone to war and the national debt hadn't changed over the next 102 years, the $2.9 billion of dollars, right now the national debt compounding semi-annually, because U.S. Treasury debt usually compounds semi-annually. We'd have 404 billion of national debt today. So if after President Wilson, if there hadn't been a world war and the national debt hadn't increased, the national debt would be 404 billion today. So, but with the 24 billion that he left, let's say there was no World War II and no extra debt since then, right now we'd have a national debt of 3.3 trillion. And just to let you know, I'm using an annual interest rate of 4.9%. I've taken that from Observations and Notes Blogspot. And according to them, the average interest rate on government borrowing in the U.S. since 1900 has been about 4.9%. So I use 4.9%. So that's where we are. So, and the other comparison I did, I looked at President Roosevelt, FDR, and he inherited 23 billion. So I used that number and did it till today at 4.9%. So 71 years, since the end of his administration, 23 billion. And if he hadn't added any debt, we'd have 715 billion in debt today. And then I looked at how much he actually left in debt, 259 billion over 71 years and 4.9% compounded semi-annually. The national debt would be 8 trillion today. Not as much as 20 trillion. And then let's have a look here. I had a look at the presidents during the Bretton Woods system. So Harry Truman, Dwight D. Eisenhower, JFK, and LBJ. And the average increase in the national debt under those presidents was only 8.25%. Nixon inherited 350 billion national debt from LBJ. And if he'd only increased the national debt by 8.25%, I did that calculation as well. Let's have a look here. We would now, after 41 years, have 2.7 trillion in national debt. But as we know, President Nixon, he closed the gold window. He, started a lot of the money printing that led to the closing of the gold window in 1971. So he actually increased the national debt by 34% to, to 475 billion from 354. A lot of people talk about how Lyndon Johnson spent a lot of money and increased the debt. He increased it by 13%, which is higher than that 8.25 average. I agree. But if you look at here, from Nixon forward, he increased the national debt by 34%, Ford by 47%, Jimmy Carter by 43%, and Reagan, he's the one really who's supposed to be conservative, but he actually increased the national debt by 186%. And I agree, that's a lot less than FDR, which had 1,000+%, and Wilson, which was 700+%, but it's still a lot. He he was left a national debt of 988 billion by Jimmy Carter, and when he left, he had added 1.86 trillion. So he turned a 998 billion national debt to 2.8 trillion. So he, under his administration, a lot more debt was added. So looking at Reagan, for example, I did some calculations here as well. If he hadn't added any debt, if he'd left the 998 billion, and after him no other president had added to the debt, we'd have a national debt right now of 5.4 trillion. So you can see the power of compounding and added debt. But the point of this really is to show you that without World War I, which increased the national debt by 700%, and without World War II, which increased the national debt by 1,000% plus, and without the ripping apart of the Bretton Woods system and the gold anchor, the national debt today would be a lot lower, and it's uncontrollable. So my view is that we need to look at the numbers and stop blaming the presidents and because I don't think it's they do sign things, but I think they're just a figurehead. The biggest culprits, in my opinion, are the monetary system and wars. And who's behind those? I mean, even President Wilson, who signed the Federal Reserve law into effect. He signed the Federal Reserve Act, which created the Federal Reserve Bank. Even he said, and this is from his book, The New Freedom. He says, "Since I entered politics, I have chiefly had men's views confided to me privately. Some of the biggest men in the United States in the field of commerce and manufacture are afraid of somebody, are afraid of something. They know that there's a power somewhere so organized, so subtle, so watchful, so interlocked, so complete, so pervasive that they had better not speak above their breath when they speak in condemnation of it." And the other comment he made from this book as well, The New Freedom, and I quote President Wilson, he says, "A great industrial nation is controlled by its system of credit. Our system of credit is privately concentrated. The growth of the nation, therefore, and all our activities are in the hands of a few men. We have come to be one of the worst ruled, one of the most completely controlled and dominated governments in the civilized world. No longer a government by free opinion, no longer a government by conviction and the vote of the majority, but a government by the opinion and the duress of small groups of dominant men." And he didn't mention who these men were specifically, but I think we can kind of deduct who they are. So it will be interesting to see if Trump's for real. If he's for real and he really wants to change things, he needs to change the monetary system, and I haven't heard him speak about that. So there you have it. Don't blame the presidents for the national debt. Blame the monetary system, the fiat money system, and specifically blame World War I and World War II. So that's it for now. If you enjoy my video, please give me a thumbs up. Share it far and wide. If you haven't subscribed to my channel yet, please do. And if you'd like to donate to my channel, there's some links in the description below. Thanks for watching. Bye.